Now that we have this working foundation, we can actually start animating it so that it's really a motion design. So let's take a look at how we can work with expressions so that they'll allow us to animate something that's dynamic like this. So I'm gonna really quickly add a text animator onto this layer, which if you're not familiar with text animators, check out my class, The Ultimate Guide to Text Animators in After Effects, where I teach you absolutely everything you need to know about them. But I'm just gonna do a very simple scale animation. I'll add that and then modify this just a little bit. We're going to change the scale down to 0, so it scales all of my characters down, and I'm gonna change the range selector inside of the advanced controls from square to ramp up. And now as I animate the offset, I can kind of wipe this on. So let's go to the beginning of the comp, set a keyframe at -100 on the offset, and then go forward maybe 20 frames and turn this all the way back up to 100%. So now this is going to animate on, and I can make this a little bit nicer if I grab the ease low and crank that up. That's kind of like the ease out for each one of the individual characters. So that now animates on really nice, and the box follows it, because remember we had source rect at time. So the source rectangle for this layer at this given time is this size. And as we move forward, it resizes dynamically. That's great if that's what you want it to look like, but let's say I don't want that box to scale up with the text. I want to animate it independently of the text and just have it resolve or end up the right size, no matter what text is typed in here. Well, that's exactly where that parentheses, the opening and closing parentheses on source rect at time comes into play. So let's dive back into our expressions. A really easy way to bring them up is to select the layer that has the expressions and double tap the E key. So I'm just gonna tap EE, and that brings up all of the expressions for that layer. I don't need to worry about the position right now, I'm just concerned with the size, so I'll collapse that up. And let's jump in here. So in between the two parentheses, this is where we can determine at what point in time we're reading the source rectangle value. Now, by 1 second into my comp, my animation on the text is complete. So why don't we just start there as our reference point? We want to get the source rectangle at 1 second in this comp. So if we go back into our expression, in between those two parentheses, I'm just going to type 1, because this time value is measured in seconds, and just click off. Now, if I scrub my animation back, well, it's doing something, but it's not doing exactly what we want. It's the right size the whole time, but it's moving around. And that is because our position value actually does need to be modified a little bit. If we go into it, this is also using source rect at time. So all I need to do is go into this expression and add the 1 to that source rect at time as well. If I apply that, now that rectangle is going to stay the size that it's supposed to be at the end of the animation, and it will not move because it's grabbing the source rect at time value at 1 second and ignoring all the other time in the timeline. But watch what happens. I'm going to bring up the keyframes by pressing U with that layer selected. If I grab these two keyframes and scoot them past the 1 second mark, as soon as I do, that box starts to get smaller again. And it's because the source rect at time value at 1 second is no longer the end of the animation. So the box is looking at basically a rectangle value of 0, 0. Now, if I move these back to the start and I actually move the entire layer, you're going to notice the same thing is not true, because this at time value is actually relative to the layer, not to the comp. So this is 1 second in to that layer. And you might not have known this, but every layer has a start point. And to prove it to you, if I extend this back in time, you see that we have these tiny little hash marks. These are letting you know that this is extending beyond the starting point of that layer. So even if I do that, it's not affecting the time value. This would technically be negative time on this layer. So moving this layer around in time doesn't affect the expression. It's the keyframes within the layer relative to the endpoint or the starting frame of that layer that matters. But now that I have that set up, I could animate the rectangle independently of the text. So why don't we just move this text layer out of the way and say that I want this to scale up from the left side to the right side, and then have the text animate in. Well, let's take a look at the structure of this layer and see what a good way to do this might be. If we go into the rectangle group, and I'm going to rename this really quickly and call this text box group, just so we understand that is a group, it's not a shape. Because every group in a shape layer has its own transform controls. The rectangle path itself, this shape, has a size and a position. Those are unique values to the rectangle path shape. But any shape group has transform controls. So instead of messing with the size or position values that already have expressions on them on that rectangle, I'm going to use the transform controls of the shape group to animate this on. So let's take a look at the scale property. I want to unlink the X and Y and animate on the X. Now it's already basically doing what I want it to because the anchor point is near that bottom left side. But again, it's not exactly where it needs to be because it's based on the text layer's anchor point, remember. So what do we need to do to get the anchor point for this shape group to be aligned not only to the left edge of the rectangle, but also to the left edge of this margin that we included? Well, we're going to use some of the same expressions. First of all, I want the position to be whatever the anchor point is. Keeping those two values the same will prevent the shape group from actually moving around on screen. Let me show you what I mean. If I offset this by, say, 100 pixels on the position, let me type that in, and then I also offset the anchor point by 100, then it's right back where we started. So since I want to move that anchor point around to get it to line up to that left edge, I'm just going to use the property pick whip and grab that anchor point value so that the position value is always identical to the anchor point. So if I move the anchor point around now, the shape group itself does not move. All right, let me zero that back out. And how do we get this back over to the left edge? Well, we need to write an expression. So let's hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and click on that stopwatch and write in some variables. And actually, just like before, we can reuse some of the same variables. So let's go into the rectangle path, into the position, and just copy all of the variables that we have here. So the source text, the width, height, left, and top values from source rect at time. I'll copy that, go back into my new expression, and paste. So these are just the variables. What do we want the array to be? Well, we need to account for this offset value, which is being driven by an offset paths. So we actually need to add that variable in as well. So let's drop down a line, type var, and I'll just use O for offset. And then we need to find that value. I'm going to get an error for a second while we find this, but there it is, offset paths. And I need to use this amount value. So under that variable, I'm going to use the expression pick whip, grab the amount, and close that off with a semicolon. Okay, let's collapse this down so we can see what we're doing again and start writing our array. So I'll start by writing a left square bracket. After Effects finishes off the right one. And for the X value on this anchor point, I want it to be the offset value minus the left value. Remember, the left is the distance between that origin point and the left of the text layer. So I'll say O plus L. Make sure to finish that line off with a semicolon. And then I'll do a comma for the second value, and for the height, let's just leave it a hard-coded 0 for now. I'm not going to be animating that, so leaving it at 0 is actually fine. So let's apply that and see what happens. The box didn't move, so that's a good sign, but let's zoom in here with this selected. We can see that anchor point is not where we want it to be. It's on the right side. We want it to be over here on the left side. And that's because the positive axis directions are right and up. So adding positive values of the offset and the left is actually pushing it in the wrong direction. So I actually need to subtract the offset. The L can stay the same. That left edge value should be added, but we need this O to be a negative number. So I'm just going to go back into my expression and type a minus before that O, and we're going to get a negative offset plus the left value. If I apply that and look at that anchor point again, I'll zoom in nice and close and look at that. It is 100% perfectly aligned to the left side of that rectangle, including our offset paths. Even if I go down and I increase that amount, the anchor point is always going to stick to that left edge now. What that means is that the shape group, which contains the rectangle path, can now be animated on that scale property from the left edge, and that left edge will not move. So that's exactly what I needed. Let's set a keyframe on that scale and just press U to show just that keyframe. And I'll bring this maybe to 20 frames in. And then at frame 1, I'll change the X value on that scale to 0. Play that back, and now we've got this scaling up. I can make this look a little nicer if I go into the graph editor, make sure I'm on the speed graph, and then grab this handle and make this a nice sharp curve. There we go. So now we have this text box scaling out to the size of the final animated text. And if I bring that text layer back, I can now time this to start animating on even at the same time that the text box is. And there we go, we've got a working animation, and this will dynamically update no matter what I type in here. So if I said Skillshare, it's going to animate. If I made it a shorter word like, I don't know, top, it's still going to animate out, and that rectangle is going to resize no matter what. This is where things start to get really fun, because we can start playing around with the design and create graphics that are based on the shape of the text that they're behind. I could add a second text box just by duplicating this, since all of those expressions are going to copy over as well. And I'll call this one, I don't know, accent box. And we'll move the text box and the text layer forward in time just a little bit so we can focus on this first one. And maybe I'll change that fill color to be the same color as the text, something like that. Let's just get that exact color so we're consistent. And now we're going to have this first box come out, and I'll just give it a couple of frames, maybe 2 frames, and then bring the next box out. So now we have that nice little accent line coming out to start. Again, I can change this to my name if I wanted to, and scale it down a little bit so it fits on the screen, reposition it, do whatever I need to, and it's all dynamic. And while I do think that it's really important that you understand exactly what's going on here, that's why I spent so much time trying to give you as much detail and explanation as possible into these expressions, the reality is once you have this built, you never have to redo this. You can save this project file and use it like a template moving forward. In fact, you can come up to File, Save As, and then change the type from After Effects Project to After Effects Template Project. And what this will do is save an After Effects project that when you open it will not modify this template file. It will create a new project based on whatever you saved within this template. So you could just save this as the text box template, and it will be the foundation for whatever design you want to create from that point. So it is important to understand how this is all working, but you don't have to put in all of this work every single time you want to make a template. I really hope that you're able to see the possibilities that expressions are opening up inside of After Effects. And in the next couple of lessons, we're going to push this design even further to turn it into a lower third. And it'll have a little bit more animation to it, some more features, and we're even going to stylize it a bit more. At this point, you should get in there and try to animate this for yourself and make sure that it's all updating properly. When you change the text layer, change the font, anything that you do to that, the animation is preserved. And don't get too hung up on the design of the template at this point. It's fine that it's just a rectangle behind text. In a few lessons, we're gonna take a look at how to stylize this and how you can actually turn this into something that looks a little bit more fun than text on top of a box.